call ourselves to order.
Someone already suggested.
Welcome to Trends in Biography, Session 1. We do have an afternoon session in case some of you want to pass that word along to people who may not realize that. We're have a wonderful, distinguished panel today. I'm Quincy Whitney, a former journalist and working on a biography about Carleen Hutchins, who is a violin maker extraordinaire. And I'm starting to write that after about 10 years of research. We have a very distinguished panel today, which I'd like to give a short. We have wonderful bios in our program, so I'm just going to give you a short description about each person. We have Megan Marshall, who's an award-winning biographer. She's won several awards for her first major biography on the Peabody Sisters, the Francis Parkman Prize, which was given by American historians, and among the other awards was Massachusetts Book Award in nonfiction. Then we have Helen Atsma, who is the senior editor at Holt, at Henry Holt and Company, and Gayle Feldmen. And Gayle has spent her entire career in publishing also, but is currently the U.S. correspondent for the Bookseller of London, which is our equivalent to Publishers Weekly. She's also writing the biography of Bennett Cerf, the founder of Random House. And I'd like to start the format today, I think that would work well, is for each panelist to give a short introduction and comments that they want to address about the subject, trends in biography. And then at the end of that 3 presentations, I will shoot some questions their direction, and then we'll turn it over to the audience after we've gone through some of those questions. That sound good? So, why don't we start with Megan?
Okay. Well, I think although we're all here gathered celebrating biography, there's been some talk in the air that perhaps biography is, the big doorstop biography is kind of off the shelf these days in the new era of publishing, although Helen can speak to that. But I was looking in the New York Times book review on last Sunday, and saw that of the 12 nonfiction books reviewed, 6 were biographies of one sort or another. So that's half of the nonfiction were biographies. There were, and I think the kinds of biographies here reveal something about what we can call the trends, different types of biographies that are being written. There were 2 straight biographies, you might call it, one of Nietzsche by Julian Young. I'm going to just read a bunch of titles here to publicize these books by Julian Young. A biography of Irene Nemirovsky by Olivier Philipponnat and Patrick Lienhardt. There was a slice of a life, I like to think of it, slice of a life biography of Martin Heidegger by Emmanuel Fay. This was focusing on Heidegger's Nazism as revealed in the unpublished seminars of 1933 to 35. So that's another way to go about finding a narrative in a life, is to look at just a slice of it. There were 2 biographies of pairs of people. Daniel Meyer Kotkin's book Stranger from Abroad about Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger, Friendship and Forgiveness. It's interesting to just hear all these subtitles too, because that's another trend in biography. You can't just give the name of the subject. It's even maybe the title. Here's one, Marion Mead's book Lonely Hearts, The Screwball World of Nathaniel West and Eileen McKenney. So that's a kind of a biography of a marriage, not even putting their names in the main title. Then a biography of, this is another trend, a household name deconstructed, I think of it, Marla Miller's biography called Betsy Ross and the Making of America. So she's looking at, who was the real Betsy Ross, what did she actually do, and then kind of making her larger than life yet again in a new way. So that's 6 out of the 12, and then there was a 7th book that in a way is a quasi-group biography, Kim Severson's book, Spoon-Fed, How 8 Cooks Saved My Life, which was a memoir constructed of profiles of influential female chefs. Then another bit of evidence of the strength of biography, I get the newsletter for the Harvard Bookstore every month, and their May newsletter was a focus on history and recommending 5 books in history, and all 5 were biographical in one way or another. So there was a straight biography, David and Jean Heidler's Henry Clay, The Essential American, which sounds I don't know. I'm still gripped by these. I don't know how big the book is, but I imagine it to be a big book, an important book. Another slice of a life, and also with a group, 2 subjects: Nathaniel Philbrook's The Last Stand, Custer, Sitting Bull, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And that's so a way people are they're taking historical moments and drawing the figures out of it. There was a group biography focused on a moment in time. Evan Thomas's book, The War Lovers, Roosevelt, Lodge, Hearst, and the Rush to Empire, 1898. So that was a specific year, 3 characters. Again, writing history through personality. Then Nick Bunker's Making Haste from Babylon, The Mayflower Pilgrims and Their World, A New History. So again, the people. And Jack Rakoff's Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America, which is a sort of roundup of founding fathers. So what I was thinking about, it might be helpful to talk about these different ways of making a narrative out of a life, aside from the whole life, as I think maybe it says someplace in our materials, is the cradle to grave biography. Are we going to do something other than that these days? And I guess I'm myself guilty of doing that in my Peabody Sisters book, which sort of ended at the halfway mark in the lives of these 3 sisters. And I have to confess, my hope was that my publisher, who had said, oh, we would never do 2 volumes on this, would be overwhelmed by demand for more if I ended halfway. But anyhow, so here are some categories that I think maybe we can talk about them later, but and these are all categories that have recent, really interesting books coming out in them. So there's the slice of a life, as I said, or grabbing onto a captivating aspect of a person. So Gillian Gill's book, We Two, Victoria and Albert, Rulers, Partners, Rivals. So this is a way of writing about Queen Victoria, but not doing the whole life. That's been done too many times, maybe. She's writing about the marriage. Fred Kaplan had a biography, Lincoln, the biography of a writer. So it's not everything you wanted to know or already knew about Lincoln. It's Lincoln as a writer, which makes it feel new again. There was a book by Stanley Plumley, the poet, called Posthumous Keats, a personal biography. So that's kind of his passion for Keats is revealed in this biographical work. Another type of biography, what I call the household names reconsidered, as in the Betsy Ross book. I noticed that this year there are 3 biographies of Cleopatra coming out, and one's already out in the spring. There's another in the summer, and Stacy Schiff has her Cleopatra biography coming out in the fall. So obviously someone thinks, let's look at these so famous you wouldn't even maybe think you could write a biography about them. Try it anyway. Then kind of the opposite way of going about it is the unknown person. You find an unknown person but want to make a larger point with that person's life. And this has been done for, obviously for many years. Maybe the most famous example is Natalie Zeman Davis's The Return of Martin Gare. She's found, evidence of through legal records of a person and built a tale out of that. And then, more recently, Laurel Ulrich's A Midwife's Tale, again, somebody you might not think was normally deserving of biography. She has used this diary of the midwife to really call up a whole era of American history. There's a book that came out a year or so ago that I thought was really fascinating, again doing this similar kind of thing, called Amalia's Tale by David Kurtzer. Amalia's Tale, and here's the subtitle, which tells you everything, or half of everything: a poor peasant, an ambitious attorney, and a fight for justice. And this is about a wet nurse in 19th century Italy and the problem of syphilis, and it just, anyway, all of this came up in a court case, which allowed him, again, to really talk a lot about 19th century Italy and women's lives and the law and lots of stuff. And actually, it was a rather small book, very readable. So I recommend that. Another trend I've noticed is biographies of paintings. Deborah Davis had a book called, these happen to be both about John Singer Sargent paintings. Deborah Davis had a book called Strapless, John Singer Sargent and the Fall of Madame X, about his famous painting Madame X with the strap up or down. You can read the book and find out. And then Erica Hirschler's recent book, Sargent's Daughters. Her subtitle is A Biography of a Painting, because it is an unusual thing to do. But this is about the painting that's at the MFA in Boston, the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, 4 sisters, quite famous. And she, this is biographical in a way about Sargent, but also about the figures in the painting, as is Deborah Davis's book. So that's another possibility to think about. Another whole way of doing biography that I find particularly fascinating is a sort of group biography. I think of it as groups on location or in significant moments in time. And these are often written by literary critics who are doing literary criticism without doing theory. They're finding a way of interpreting work somewhat biographically, but also just valuing the work. So a wonderful example of that is Christopher Benfey's A Summer of Hummingbirds, and he's got a huge subtitle, Love, Art, and Scandal in the Intersecting Worlds of Emily Dickinson, Mark Twain, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Martin Johnson Head, an artist. So it's a group of people who are kind of tangentially, or some of them directly connected, others kind of tangentially, and this hummingbird is the metaphor that he finds in their work. And he's a great literary critic, but also a good, biographer. There's biography in this. Some really great new material about Emily Dickinson that I can recommend to you. And let's see, another example like this, it is literary in a sense, but Richard Holmes' recent book, he's moved away a bit from biography towards, but it is still biographical, The Age of Wonder, The Romantic Generation and Discovery of the Beauty and the Terror of Science. So again, a group of people, all kind of a constellation of people that he's gathered together around a subject. Susan Quinn, she's right here. She had has a wonderful book called Furious Improvisation, How the WPA and a Cast of Thousands Made High Art Out of Desperate Times. So there's a couple of main characters, Hallie Flanagan, Harry Hopkins, and of course all of the Roosevelt administration and the actors. Another kind of group, a way of going at biography through a group, and getting a lot more balls in the air. It's a juggling act. And then I noticed in one of the panelists here, Robert Canagal, is that, how do you pronounce it, Canagal? Mm-hmm. He's working on a book about the literary visitors to the Great Blasket, an island off of Ireland. And Carla Kaplan, another biographer who is working on the white women of the Harlem Renaissance. So these are books in the making, and another way to turn. And then the last category that I think is really fascinating, how many people are working on fictional biographies. These are not, for the most part, I think they're not kind of spun out of nothing. These are novelists who've done really serious research about their subject and decided to write not a biography but a novel. So everybody knows about the 2 Henry James, or I guess there actually were 3 Henry James novels, but Colm Toybin's The Master and David Lodge's Author. Brian Hall wrote a book, The Fall of Frost, which is a novel about the life of Frost. T.C. Boyle's The Women, which is using Frank Lloyd Wright's life. John Pipkin's Woodsburner has Thoreau as one of 4 characters, 3 of the characters, maybe even 5. Thoreau is, I think, the only real life one. Here's one I don't know well myself, but I just noticed a review of it. Kelly McNeese, The Lost Summer of Louisa May Alcott. So here's this is more imaginary. Imagines a love affair that inspired the story of Joe and Laurie in Little Women. And then Matthew Pearl, this is another kind of way of doing it, his kind of literary mysteries. He's got 3 of them now, the Dante Club, the Poe Shadow, and the Last Dickens, all of them very thoroughly researched for the time and for the characters. Sometimes he has, 5 or 6 historical characters who he's really researched, and then he kind of sets them in motion with a with a mysterious plot that is entirely of his own invention. So, but that's another way of doing biography, I think. So I'm just going to close with another sort of evidence of trends. Is I teach a course at Emerson College in the MFA program called Writing the Lives of Others, and I have these graduate students who are nonfiction writers. Many of them have come to the field writing memoirs or essays, personal essays, but I try to get them interested in other people. And so the first half of the course they write a magazine profile of somebody living. In the second half they write something biographical, could be a chapter of a biography they might want to write, although they quickly realize how hard that is to do in half a semester, but then, or they could write a sort of literary essay about someone. So I'm just going to read to you the the subjects they came up with for their final essays, their biographical pieces: George Orwell, Fanny Farmer, Mary Wollstonecraft, General Joseph Warren, who was a forgotten hero of the American Revolution. Maybe you know, the big hero died in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Mairead Farrell, who was a young martyr in the Irish Republican Army, killed in a shootout with the authorities in the 1980s. Gertrude Berg, who's also Molly Goldberg, the writer and actress. Andrew Carnegie, Le Corbusier, George Gissing, the novelist, and Eric Hoffer, the longshoreman philosopher. And I think that sort of shows you what their interests are, because they're maybe potential readers or potential writers of biography. They're interested in the big names and the small names. And, I think of that 10, there are probably 3 or 4 really viable biographies there. We'll see if they do it.
Thank you. That was quite an overview.
Trends.
Well, I'm speaking from a slightly different perspective, which is as an acquiring editor at Henry Holt. And I was emailing with Quincy earlier about all sorts of trends that I see, both in terms of subject and in terms of how we publish books and in terms of biographies that are not really viable for my house to publish. And so one of the things Quincy wanted us to address was also, how do you kind of sort out what would be something appropriate for a university press and what would be something that's appropriate for a larger house. I'm not going to release numbers for my house, but I'll tell you that where I worked before, and you can Google me and look that up, we had to apply an overhead of $90,000 against every book we published. And that did not include the advance. That did not include, marketing expenses. That was nothing. That was just what it cost to turn on the lights, to pay for the salaries. That was the basic number that was applied against the book before we went into production costs for that specific book, before we went to what we were advancing the author. And I tell that to you just because I do see a lot of proposals cross my desk that seem utterly worthy and brilliant and are by what I would say the person, and that's a term we often use in our editorial meetings. Well, she's the woman to write this, or he's the guy. And sometimes you get proposals and you think this isn't a good match, or of another scholar who knows more about the subject. But you will get a really worthy biography that's by the person, and it's on a subject that perhaps hasn't been explored yet. And then you think about that number, and you think about doing a P&L, and you have to think, are 20,000 people going to go out and buy the hardcover for this? Because that's what I'm facing. Mm-hmm. And if the answer is no, and we sadly, many of our books do not sell 20,000 copies in hardcover, but we hope they will at the time of acquisition. And if at the time of acquisition we can't even quite muster that sort of enthusiasm for it, it's not going to work for us. So, for example, a couple months ago, I had a marvelous proposal for Toscanini, and it was the person and the book, and there hasn't been much written on Toscanini even for some time. And I had to turn it down, and I believe it's Oxford University Press took it on. And I'm so happy and delighted in it. And a smaller university press, because it's a smaller house, because they have financial issues themselves, but it's a different kind of overhead. It's a smaller overhead, and they can make a profit or break even by selling fewer copies of books than we can. And that's often kind of what I'm facing. So with thinking about numbers often, I've seen a lot of good trends in terms of how publishers are trying to market books with unconventional subjects. And I was also emailing with Quincy about a book that's, I think, number 4 or something on the trade paperback nonfiction list right now, called The Lost City of Z. If you went into Barnes & Noble and saw this book, you would not even think it was a biography. It looks like an adventure story about an explorer who went into South America, and it's very much marketed. The cover, the title, it's flashy, and it's being marketed as a big adventure book.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it's written by a New Yorker writer, and is actually essentially sort of almost a slice in the life biography of Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, who was a great explorer at the time, who disappeared, and nobody really knew what happened to him. And that's a choice that a lot of publishers are making. If you have the obscure person, if you're getting a proposal for, I am writing a book on Colonel Fawcett, and you've never heard of this person, but he's genius, and this is why, and this is what happened, I would just think too small. I don't know how to publish that. But if I'm reading a proposal, and again, a lot of it is in the writing and how energetic it is and how well researched it is, and of course having a New Yorker writer obviously is amazing, but it helps you think how big the book could possibly be. And that's what I'm always trying to think. How big can we make this book? We've had recent success with Betsy Ross and the Making of America, which is a whole book. It just came out. And the interesting thing about that book is, as the title, or the subtitles, no, I think that's actually part of the title, indicates, is it's a biography of Betsy Ross, but really there's not that much known about Betsy Ross. And this Biographers unearthed everything there is to know, but it had to be a bigger book. If it was just going to be a book on Betsy Ross, even with that kind of name recognition, it would be a very slim volume. But she really turned it into a book about Philadelphia at the time and all the things that were facing America at the time. And it's a very big book about that period. And I think that's what reviewers are latching on to. And I think then having the name recognition of this person that everyone grew up hearing about, Betsy Ross making the flag, but nobody really knows who she was or what she did. The author really has kind of placed her into the context. So even though the actual details of her life, some are still obscure, we can get a picture of who she was kind of based on the time that she lived. We're also doing really well with a biography that Harriet Reason, who I think is at this conference, wrote about Louisa May Alcott. And partly that's, I think, a bit driven by publicity. There was a big PBS thing on Louisa May Alcott that Harriet was very involved in. But again, Alcott captures the imagination of a lot of American readers, and there hadn't been that much published recently on her. There was a book a few years ago that was about Alcott and her father, and I think she has been part of a number of group biographies on that, during that period, but still this kind of is breaking her out in a way that hasn't been done before. Sadly, I see a trend that kind of breaks my heart in terms of sales of 20th century American literary biography, and I have some books under contract that I'm hoping will buck this trend, but I looked up some numbers and this is just to kind of fill you in on what I'm facing again when I acquire, because I think that's kind of all I can offer. But, Blake Bailey's Cheever, A Life, could a book get more or better reviews than that book got? I mean, it was covered everywhere, and the praise was enormous and stupendous. And on Bookscan, it sold less than 15,000 copies in hardcover. This is a book that they paid a lot of money for, and I'm sure it took him a while to write. The World Is What It Is, the biography of V.S. Naipaul, that got coverage everywhere, again, on kind of a great literary figure, someone who has a very complicated life that made, I think, for interesting biography, less than 10,000 copies. The biography of James Tiptree Jr., which was kind of a smallish biography, and then it also got coverage everywhere, less than 5,000 copies. I also know the recent biography on Raymond Carver, you're looking at less than 10,000 copies. So this is very hard for me when I'm thinking of, when I get biographies that are set in this period with these kinds of American writers. I'm thinking, if Blake Bailey's book can't sell any copies, this is going to be challenging. Now, there are books that buck that trend. One is Charles Shields, who is also here, who is my author, wrote a biography of Harper Lee that did really tremendously well for us. And I think she's someone who everybody read in high school. There's kind of a universal recognition there that isn't maybe there even with someone like Cheever. He's writing also a biography of Vonnegut. That'll be his next book that we publish. And I think I'm very hopeful of the success of that, both because Vonnegut is, again, someone that everyone kind of universally reads in high school and feels super cool the first time they read a Vonnegut novel. And Vonnegut also had a really crazy life that makes for interesting biography. And Chip is a storyteller. So this is another this is another thing I face too. Sometimes I get biographies that the subject is good and perhaps possibly big enough for me to take on, but the writing feels too academic and there isn't enough storytelling there. And really, when you're writing a biography for a trade audience, it just, like, that life has to leap off of the page and it cannot be super dry. And that's something I'm always looking at in terms of, the first question before all of these numbers I'm giving you is it a good book? Will it be a good book? And sometimes the answer is yes, and I still can't pursue it. But if the answer is yes, then that's always a really great starting point. Then I always see these trends in subjects. Yeah, Cleopatra is everywhere right now. At Holt, I worked on a biography. I didn't acquire it, but I inherited it during later stages, called House of Wits, which was a joint biography of, Henry James. Thank you. But it came, that the sad thing about that book, as smart and brilliant as it was, is it was a bit late being delivered and a bit late coming in. And the previous year, there were literally 4 books published on various members of the James family. And really, that's already kind of a hard situation to be in because you're competing for review space. Everyone's going to do a group review, so they're going to give you 3 paragraphs instead of a whole page. And then you're praying that your book wins the review. the reviewer at the end of the review is saying, well, this is the one you should really buy. But when you miss that schedule and you're a year later, people feel like they've already visited the topic. And he still got a tremendous amount of review coverage, even given that situation, but it was a hard one to face. And there's another biography being written on Sargent now. In fact, I think there are another 2. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting too. And I don't know, we don't always know when we acquire who else is off working on the subject. But anyway, that's just a little overview of the trends I see in terms of what's working. I think in terms of reinventing the marketing for some books that could feel small, and some of these subjects that I see a lot, but also in terms of sales.
A biographical irony. I'm a number phobe, but I'm going to spend most of the time talking about numbers. And my first published book was a memoir, and I'm going to argue, and can be, contradicted. I don't think that memoir and biography and autobiography should be considered together. And I think that's a big problem for people who do biography. I will just say 2 quick things that relate to Richard Holmes just signed a multi-book contract, and one of the books he's doing is a book about biography. So he's not left biography.
Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't say that.
No, but just to say, people might be interested in the fact that he's going to write a book about biography. And from a previous life, when I was book news editor at Publishers Weekly for many years, I would say it's unfortunate timing sometimes. Sometimes people will jump on a bandwagon, and you don't want to jump on a bandwagon, because the number of times that I had to write stories about 3 or 4 or 5 books that were all on the same subject, one of those books makes it and sells, and the others fade, never to be heard from again, and you think of all the work that went in. What I've done is I talked to the people at Bookscan. Bookscan is, does everybody know what Bookscan is? Okay. When you buy a book from Barnes & Noble or Borders, or you're independent, or Amazon, when you buy a book, from about 70% of books that are sold, those actual sales numbers are reported to a Nielsen company called Bookscan. They measure book sales in the way that Nielsen measures TV, et cetera, et cetera. So I got in touch with them because I thought it might be interesting to know what in biography has sold and what has not sold, that real numbers might concentrate the mind wonderfully well. They plonk biography, memoir, autobiography, and lots of other things, history, it's all together, which means it's very confusing. When you take the year 2009, which is what the figures I got, there were, 288 million units, actual books of nonfiction that were sold, according to Bookscan. And as I said, they don't get sales reports from places like Walmart. So, some books that might sell in huge quantities at Walmart are not included. So, okay. But they say 288 million, of which they said biography was 29.7 million. So 29.7 million units of books were biographies. But when you look at the individual categories, the biggest category in biography, personal memoirs. And 22% of biographies, personal memoirs. The next biggest is political books, 6.7%, okay? Religious, 4.3%. Presidents and heads of state, just about 4%. I mean, it's a huge, huge difference. We are drowning in memoirs. And this doesn't even include the self-published, memoirs, of which there are thousands and thousands and thousands now coming every year. So that's a kind of background in terms of the numbers. I mean, and to go, right down, composers and musicians, classical. Ooh. In terms of sales, I'm afraid you made the right call on Toscanini, much though I love his recordings, okay? So, huge, huge difference. And as I said, history and biography also confused a lot. There's a huge difference if you look at adventurers who write memoirs and sell lots of copies, as opposed to biographies of adventurers. A huge difference, actors or actresses writing their memoirs or having them ghostwritten as opposed to biographies. I mean, if you want to write a biography of an actor or actress, I would suggest you try and be their ghost instead if you want to sell books. Same thing with journalists' memoirs as opposed to journalists' biographies. Same thing with sports memoirs as opposed to sports biographies. Now, there are always exceptions. These are just general. Brand names. If your name is Doris Kearns Goodwin, if your name is David McCullough, if your name is Walter Isaacson. One year there were 3 or 4 books about Benjamin Franklin. The one that sold was Walter Isaacson. I think if your name is John Meacham now. Tracy Kidder. Does what Tracy Kidder do, is he writing biographies? I don't know. He's listed as biography. He's definitely a brand name. In certain categories, there are brand names specific to that category. For instance, British royalty. Well, if your name is Antonia Fraser, or if your name is, one of Antonia Fraser's daughters, you're a brand name. There's also somebody named Alison Weir, whom I didn't know about, but if you're interested in British royals, she's somebody clearly recognized. Then, of course, there are the subjects. My biographical subject, Bennett Cerf, all over the internet. I mean, I get Google alerts on Bennett Cerf, and rarely does a week go by when he's not quoted for saying, if you want the perfect bestseller, the title would be Lincoln's Doctor's Dog. 3 categories that sell. In fact, as with many things, it's apocryphal. That was around long before Bennett came to quote it. But Lincoln, 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 okay? And these days, Obama, 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 and founding fathers as well. I found it interesting that some books continue to sell in hardcover even when the paperback is out. Again, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, as I will tell you in a minute. Also, Meacham's American Lion. But the long life is in trade paperback. Literary biographies, scientific biographies, not so high. The biggest sales are with the biggest publishers. Some books go on for a long time in paperback, 8, 10, 15 years. Power Broker, published in 1975. Last year it still sold 7,000 copies in trade paperback. That's not bad. You'd like that, wouldn't you? And Ancients, I was very surprised that Cicero, Plutarch, they're still selling. New tranches, new wrinkles, Lincoln as writer, FDR as traitor to his class, Truman's automobile trip, contrasting then and now. I also noticed graphic biographies. We've got graphic novels, well, graphic biographies of Trotsky and Che Guevara. Okay, let's look at a few numbers. In the biographical category for Bookscan last year, the biggest seller, and as I said, this book sold a lot more because it sold in other places as well. Not a biography, Sarah Palin. She sold that. Ted Kennedy, 560,000. Joe Torre, 330,000. Andre Agassi, 309,000. The first real biography was this number 16 in the top 100. Number 16, this is hardcover. It was John Meacham's American Lion. Okay, and it was, again, the real number will be more than this, but this is a sign of the direction. 81,000. Then number 22, The Wilderness Warrior, Teddy Roosevelt. Douglas Brinkley's book, President, a known biographer, 58,000. Number 26, Renegade, The Making of a President, Richard Wolff's book about Obama, 50,000. Is this a biography or is this politics? I don't know. That's something to think about. Warren Buffett clocks in at 32, The Snowball, Alice Schroeder's book. That was about 45,000. Number 41, The Accidental Billionaires, the founding of Facebook. About Facebook founders, 39,000. Paul Newman, A Life, big ho name, 31,000. You would have expected more. Secret Life of Marilyn Monroe, 29,000. You would have expected more. American Rebel, The Life of Clint Eastwood, 21,000. The Queen Mother, 19,000. Team of Rivals, hardcover, almost 18,000. And that book is a few years old. So that's hardcover. If you look at trade paperback, the top 6 books were, again, not biographies. 3 Cups of Tea, Dreams from My Father, Eat, Pray, Love, The Glass Castle, Julie and Julia, not biographies. What was the top biography in trade paperback? Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, 211,000. And that was a book that was published in 2006. What was the second? American Lion. It was on both lists. That was 131,000. Founding Brothers. Joseph Ellis, 47,000. John Adams, which was published 9 years ago, to the 33,000. Einstein, Walter Isaacson, 24,000. So that's the 2 general, all hardcover, all trade paper. If you look at individual category lists, for instance, if you look at the category historical, just historical general, there's a book called Angels and Ages, a short book, and I thought short was the operative word, about Darwin, Lincoln, and modern life by Adam Gopnik, New Yorker writer. 16,000 copies. The Last Empress, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. It was published at the end of the year, but published in time for Christmas. 8,000 copies. Trade paperback. The first book was Founding Brothers, Joseph Ellis, 47,000 in paperback. His Excellency George Washington, 18,000. Mao, The Unknown Story, Zhong Chang, 10,000. That book, though, was published in 2006. The 12 Caesars Suetonius I mentioned earlier, the classic steel cell, well, 3,300 for an edition that came out in 2007. Literary biography. Shall I go on?
We're depressing.
Would you like me to tell you a few more, or would you like me to sit down and shut up?
I would like to raise a question, first of all, about this. I think you're very right that we are in such a state of transition in the genre of biography that, as Megan said, that there are 10 different versions and variations of what one might call biography.
Yeah.
And that to add to the confusion is the way that the book industry sells them. If you go into a Barnes & Noble, you don't know where to find a biography.
Exactly.
Because it's going to be in there with memoir, and it's going to be a biography. There might be a biography where the biographer is not visible, and then it might be a biography where their biographer is visible. So I would love, first of all, to ask the question about I guess I got 6 questions in my mind. First one is going to be about the book that bucks the trends, what surprises. And when I read Mockingbird, I have to put it in that category because I wanted to know from you, Helen, about whether Charles knew at the time he was going to have such a hard time cracking the nut. And when because the book is basically, if you haven't read Mockingbird, it's about the failure of a biographer to get the story. In many ways, it's all about his trail, which I was fascinated with, but at the same time I thought if I was selling that book, how would that publisher agree?
Well, I should say I did not acquire Mockingbird. I was at another
Okay.
house at the time, so I'm his editor now, beginning with his biography on Vonnegut. But I think what people were interested in was the fact that there was nothing on Harper Lee. So even a book that I mean, he talked to everyone that would talk, and
Right, and then to watch how she thwarted him,
and to
was
watch
also interesting.
and
But
he
when
really,
he gave his proposal, that he
yeah,
it was submitted on a full manuscript, which I
Wow.
think
Oh, I see.
which is
That's interesting.
unusual.
So the publisher jumped off the cliff and said, let's publish this book about the struggles of a biographer. Really, it's a part memoir in many ways.
It is a part memoir in many ways. I was not at Holt at the time,
Mhm.
so I can't really speculate on what their decision was at the time. But I know actually when I was at Little Brown and we were considering the same book, it was very appealing. He's a real storyteller, and that's where I want to reinforce to all of you. The storytelling and the writing is so important, and great storytelling can buck all of these crappy numbers things that we're talking about right now. And it ended up with a great title, which is huge. I think the Peabody Sisters is a fabulous title, and Megan's not going to reveal her own numbers, but I looked them up before coming here, and they're very nice, and they would do very well on any of these lists. But I think I'm again always trying to think about from a marketing perspective. Mockingbird was not marketed as a memoir about trying to find Harper Lee. It was marketed as a biography of Harper Lee.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think people were interested in that subject and wanted to read it.
And in the sense that he told everything that you could tell about her, it is the biography.
And it was more than anyone else had done before,
Right.
which was huge. And I think very important in that regard. And I think also really established the time she was in. It's another book that kind of establishes the era, the people she was working with. That a lot of people didn't. I mean, it was kind of sort of public knowledge, but I don't think people realized how close she had grown up with Truman Capote and all of that. I think then there are books that capture the public imagination, like the Peabody Sisters, or I would look at like the Mitfords. Stories about sisters and a family. It's a biography, and it also, both of those books capture an age and an era, very different ones, but. Sisters in a title, genius. I mean, it sells books, and if you have a great book to begin with, and then you can get a great title, and then you're going to hook into something else, something the public's interested in, a book they read as a child, an iconic book, To Kill a Mockingbird, or they're interested in sisters who grew up in the same family who all went off to do, very important things in their field that we previously really weren't that aware of. I think that can really tap into something. I think those books can be really successful. So I'm sorry, too, that I've shared all these negative stories because there really are a lot of successes. Another great literary biography that was a total success last year is Flannery, the Brad Gooch biography of Flannery O'Connor. Another one where she obviously passed, decades and decades ago, but working with the estate was quite challenging. And I think Gooch being able to get what he could out of that was not an easy situation, not as hard certainly as with Harper Lee, but that book sold really nicely in hardcover, and I think we could say worked.
So
Go ahead.
just
Before I forget, I just want to mention a book that's one of my favorite books called Out of Sheer Rage by Jeff Dyer, which is about not being able to finish his book on D.H. Lawrence. So if you're feeling despair, I read it, and when I thought, I'll never finish this book on the Peabody Sisters, at least I could write about not finishing it. So I recommend that.
Let's talk about this border then between memoir and biography within the same book. We're talking, first of all, we got the problem that memoir is put on the shelf next to biography when there can be very different things. The biggest shock to me was when Angela's Ashes won the Pulitzer for biography. Which was
it is
clear,
biography and memoir. That was my problem.
Okay. So, but now let's talk within the same.
It might have switched since then because I noticed but when I was a finalist, Joan Didion's book was also a finalist about the year of, and it was called a category biography and memoir.
Yes,
is it still called
I
that?
believe it is.
So it is. It's a category that is lumped. They're lumped them together anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's talk about an instance where within the same book we have the biographer deciding to be visible.
Well, you do have again the Lost City of Z, or you look at something like even the Orchid Thief. Susan Orlean. Again, these are both New Yorker writers, and it's kind of a New Yorker tradition in a way. I think often when they're the big pieces in the middle of the magazine to explore a topic and they insert themselves into it. I think it works when it works and it doesn't when it doesn't, and that's a kind of
So is
a
there a
whole
trend?
helpful thing to say, perhaps.
Pro
but
or con right now, you think?
I think it's all in the writing.
Well, also that
I agree
you were
with you.
saying,
I
is
agree with
Tracy
you.
Kidder a biographer? I think his recent book was a kind of biography, but he was in it, so maybe that's why he got into this category. But it's not.
And even Paul Farmer. I mean, who really knew what Paul Farmer was doing before Mountains Beyond Mountains? I mean, certainly MacArthur people knew, but I didn't know. And but yes, he becomes a part of the story. He's a writer, though, who can pull that off, and a lot of people can't. And a lot of writers, I find, again, this is more at the proposal level. When Kidder set out to write about Farmer, he's in the story from the very beginning, and often you'll end up in a different situation where you're researching someone who died years ago, and that can still be done, but it's hard to do without seeming tacked on. Like, here's the life, and then P.S., here's my involvement in it. That then sets the wrong note to me. But if there's a way to engage with it, it's certainly different than a conventional biography, but I don't think from a sales perspective, which again is the perspective
Again, we
I
have a semantics problem because we don't know what to call it either.
Yes,
When you look at all the categories that Megan brought, everything is still called biography.
Yeah.
So we're in a way the
Well, that's
language
why
is
they are all
lagging
lumped
behind.
together.
And I
Right.
think that it has to be, if the author insinuates him or herself in, it has to be done out of whole cloth. The story
Exactly.
has to carry. You are the storyteller telling, and we have ancient traditions of storytellers being there telling. I do not think that fiction and biography are the same thing. I don't. I think that fiction has, fiction writers have forever gone back and looked at real people and used real people. Some have done it completely fictively. Some have done it the way Doctorow does it. But that's not biography.
This is also bringing up the question. Go ahead.
One question, because Gayle's here as a reviewer also, but the 3 books that you mentioned, that Helen mentioned as not doing well, surprisingly not doing well, my recollection is that they were not all that well reviewed. The Cheever, the Naipaul, and the Carver. Well,
Cheever was well
you
reviewed.
think
The
it
Cheever
was?
was fabulously well.
Very,
I
very well
recall,
reviewed.
maybe there's this recall.
Maybe it's just the
Maybe I'm not reading enough reviews.
The Cheever was
but
very
there was
well
maybe an
reviewed.
influential. No,
The
not
Cheever
even.
was very well reviewed.
There could have been a bad Globe review, but
No, I didn't
No,
read it.
yeah.
Because I thought
overall the Cheever was well reviewed.
Was
Overall,
it?
the
there
Naipaul,
was somebody
the
who wrote
reviews.
something really nasty about it in the London Review of Books. I guess maybe. It's but anyway, I don't know. So I was just going to say the power of the reviewer. How the power of the reviewer is
Quincy,
maybe
there are questions
all
out
the bigger.
there in the audience.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Charlotte.
Who buys biographies? You've given us the demographics of tons and tons of numbers, but who's buying?
Well, it still tends to be a hardcover audience, which translates in our perception as it's an older audience. So particularly for literary biography, I think it's an older demographic overall. Again, there are always books that totally buck that trend, and when you're writing a book like The Lost City of Z, which becomes an adventure story and which broke out in paperback and not in hardcover, there are certainly much younger writers coming to it. But I think the perception on the behalf of the publisher is that you're looking at an audience that's probably 35, 40 and up for the most part.
I think it could be
45 and up.
45, 50 and up. And I think in hardcover, you have to look at certain categories. For instance, more women
Right,
buy
so
books than men. But if you're talking about political books, hardcover, expensive, more men, I would venture, than women. Trade paperbacks, different. You get younger buyers, more women in trade paperbacks.
And then you look at, of course, Kitty Kelley's biography of Oprah. That's going to sell to a very, very wide demographic. So it's really kind of hard to just say in general. The one interesting thing about biography as a category that I am very cognizant of when doing my profit and loss statements for each book that I do before I acquire them is that biography is one of the few categories that if it's just sort of a traditional, like whether it's history or literary or, you know, kind of in these traditional subjects, in one of those categories, it's often not a category where the paperback exceeds the hardcover. In fact, we often like them because you can sell 20, 30,000 hardcovers, and maybe the paperback will match that number, but it won't go on forever, whereas, and I'm saying we like that, and you're probably going, well, why? We want the paperback to go on forever, and you would, but it means the bulk of the sales of that book are often in hardcover rather than in paperback, which is more money for you and more money for us. And I think that, again, has to do, though, with the demographic. It's an older group of people who might be willing to spend $25 on a book.
I just wanted to say about the readers of history and historical biography, when the Peabody sisters did get this Parkman Prize, and part of that was it could be offered, or was going to be offered through the History Book Club. I thought, oh great, so I get this pamphlet for the History Book Club. I don't think it was the only book that was about a woman in that whole book club. And
History Book Club's very male.
Right. So, but I think those people are buying the books, so we should be writing them.
We have another question, Susan?
Helen, I wanted to ask you about the Betsy Ross book. Did you acquire that?
I did not acquire that. I didn't edit that. That's a colleague of mine.
But what stage was it in when it was acquired?
I believe it was sold on proposal.
On proposal.
Mm-hmm.
So that proposal had already managed to convey the larger sweep of the story.
Yes, she knew exactly what she was doing. She did not, it was not a situation where she started writing and just was like, crap, there's not enough out there on Betsy Ross. She was very much placing her in the context of Philadelphia at the time. But it was also clear that there was no one who knew more about Betsy Ross than this author. I mean, utterly clear. She had done all of her homework, if I'm remembering that acquisition meeting correctly.
Could I say, publishers now want shorter books. You don't. There aren't multi-volume biographies now, whereas once upon a time they were.
Multi-volume is hard.
And also, I don't. Most publishers I know would be much happier with a 400-page biography than an 800-page biography.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true, but I think that's true of books in general. I mean, I think I added a lot of fiction, and I'm always trying to get my writers to cut, not out of actually some cognizant sense of that we'll sell more copies if we can publish this at 320 pages instead of 416, but rather out of a sense of most people overwrite, and most people include details that slow down the pacing, and whether it's with narrative nonfiction or with fiction, just because you know everything you do about a certain subject doesn't mean all of those details are interesting to the reader, and that's where a good editor comes in hand, because an editor can say, wow, this little detail just kind of flipped my perspective on this whole situation, and maybe kind of an offhand thing, whereas this is just, I don't really need to see him brushing his teeth in the morning, you know?
Okay, Linda?
I want to, because that was going to be my question about length, and none of these figures really take into account length in terms of sales. But when I approach my agent and then publishers, they all say, oh, we can't do a long biography, we can't do a doorstop biography. And yet I see, very long biographies still being published and being reviewed, and I just wondered if you could speak to that trend about length in terms of sales or in terms of...
Length is never at the time of acquisition what's foremost on my mind, other than the sense that...
It is or it isn't?
It is not. Other than the idea that, no, we probably won't do a 2-volume, because that's just very challenging unless you're a huge name. Rather, it becomes evident at the time of editing what needs to go and what does not. And again, I'm not editing to get it down to a certain page count. I mean, that would just be awful. But I'm editing because often there's more in there than there needs to be in there. And most biography is sold on proposal, so you don't, even though the author's going to say, well, I estimate this will be, 70 to 100,000 words, those estimates are always, who knows what they're going to turn out to be. As an editor, I'm very aware of that. It's when the book comes in and you see what it is and you start working with it, and you just don't want it to be a boring read. You want it to be a really lively read, and sometimes that means pruning a lot.
So when you do a contract, it doesn't have a length limit?
Well, it does, but I am interested in working with my author to get the best book possible. And if that book's going to be a little over the contractual length or a little under the contractual length, frankly, at my house and where I've worked,
that's not going to be a deal breaker unless we contract for 100,000 and a 200,000 word biography comes in. I mean, I think it does in that level, but if it's 5 or 10,000 words over, rather it's me editing, trying to get the best book possible out of the book. I do think we are always happier when it's shorter rather than longer because of the short attention span of the world today, and it's easier to get someone to read a short book.
This also brings up two different terms that have come up in my Boston biography group for what people are writing when they describe their project. One has said, I'm writing a thematic biography, and one has said, I'm writing a focused biography. And I'd love any of you to talk to maybe what we're trying to do is abbreviate the form to sell it, and in doing so, maybe we're taking a certain section of a person's life, or maybe we're dealing with a relationship, or maybe we're dealing with some theme at a particular way to look at somebody's life. You know what I mean? I'd love you to talk about anything about that. But like,
or even
is this a way that we as biographers can sell a book?
Or even a certain period in America, like the Harry Truman book, the car, his car journey.
Yes.
Can you imagine a president today getting in his car and driving, across America? I don't think so. So America then and America now. I wanted to throw a question into the mix, which I think is important, given the amount of time it takes to write a biography. In the book business today, at this moment, what everybody is talking about is not just print books, but electronic books. And 10 years from now, and there are people who are starting biographies now and might not be finishing them till then, I think most publishers think that we will have reached the tipping point by then. And how will electronic publication first, rather than print publication first, affect the writing of biographies? I think that's a very important question. Because you can see fiction, it's quite easy. But books that have endnotes, researched books, it's a whole other ballgame. And another ballgame is I asked two heads of very, very large publishing companies this past week, when are you going to start selling books like biographies, chapter by chapter, the whole book, but also individual chapters or individual sections? Because they're doing that already with certain kinds of nonfiction. And she said, I don't, she and he, I don't know. We have to find a way. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix.
Anyone else want to ask a question? One in the back?
I had a related question about footnotes and about several publications, the New York Review of Books being the most notable in my mind, now have an extended version of the article online with more extensive notes. And it seems like that's a very good solution to some of the problems that we have with the massive amount of material that we want to include in our biography that publishers don't want to. So I'm just wondering if you thought of that as a trend.
This has come up more and more often. I am still in favor of following the traditional manner in terms of definitely including all of the footnotes within the book as well as the full bibliography. Just because I think, the audience for biography is still the hardcover book, and often it's an older audience, and often they're not going to actually go online to, look up the source for a particular fact or anecdote. The question that publishers, though, are facing as, sometimes you do get a book and there are 30 pages, 40 pages for huge books at the end of footnotes and bibliographies, and we would love to cut our production costs and put those online. What we face, though, is that we feel we cannot be responsible for that content on our websites. Our contracts with our writers are very specific, and our obligations are very specific. And in a time where the digital world is changing so quickly, the question of who is responsible for that content on whose website? So are you going to put it on your website? But then what happens should things change in your own personal life and your website goes down and now we have a book out there and no one can find the link? Or do we put it on our website but then our house gets merged with another house, or it gets sold, or it folds, God forbid? I think these are real questions, and a publisher would not then want to be at the receiving end of, maybe nobody would sue over this, but their obligation is to publish that work as it came into them, and what does publish mean? And I think this is all coming up in the electronic age. I think things like this will hopefully be sorted out, but things don't always live forever online is the problem. And as an editor, I feel very strongly that at least the book is the contained unit, and whether someone finds it in a library or Borders or a used bookstore, the whole package is there. And I would always advocate that is in the best interests of my writers up until I'm proven otherwise. I do definitely, though, tell my authors on their own websites if they have anecdotal information or other things or extra photos that they cleared the rights to, or anything that can support the publicity side of the book that's not actually book content. I love for them to go as far as they want, or perhaps a super long bibliography that didn't need to be included in the book proper. But for the most part, I'm quite an advocate of keeping it within the book itself.
Footnotes are a particular problem today because people tend to err on the side of more because they're worried about plagiarism and other things. And that is a very fine balance. And sometimes I think, I find myself footnoting everything for myself and for my editors to see the map of where everything came from. I hope that then it will be possible to edit down those footnotes, edit them right down, because they get in the way, even as endnotes. But there are different things, different factors involved.
Are you near done with the book? It sounds so exciting. Well, you don't have to answer that question.
No, I'm 2/3 done actually.
I would like. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
And Gayle, I appreciate that you brought up trends. Most of us working on biographies may not actually have our biography done for the next 8 or 10 years, and I wonder if there are other trends that people can think about for the future, things that we should be aware of now as we're working along.
I would say, from the many publishers I've spoken to and editors, shorter is better. Alas, I wish I knew how to. In a memoir, I knew how to do short is best. But it is a problem when you've got somebody who's had a really big, long life. Please find subjects who didn't have long lives.
They have to die early.
Yes, they've got to die early. Or, I do think it's interesting the number of writers who have begun, their first biographies have been 20th century figures, lots of people to interview, etc., and then they move back 200 years. Look, Stacy Schiff went from Vera Nabokov and Saint-Exupéry to Benjamin Franklin and now Cleopatra. And isn't it wonderful?
Yes.
I have just 2 questions. Will a publisher look at a book proposal unless it's submitted through an agent, is the first part. And secondly, what if the author is unknown? Now, I think of 2 novelists, Deborah Dean with The Madonnas of Leningrad and Charles Frazier with Cold Mountain, books that sold very, very well, but neither one had any track record prior that I know of in publishing prior to that. So without a name recognition by the publisher and without an agent, must you have an agent?
Well, for a trade house, I think pretty generally, yes, you need an agent. And I'll tell you why. I receive about 500 manuscripts a year or proposals from agents. And I acquire about 10. And I barely have time to go through all of those, let alone all the people who email me every day who find my contact information off of Publishers Marketplace, I can't even respond. I mean, it's such a flood. I think there definitely are some different requirements at university presses and some smaller houses that I think will consider unagented material, but I think at the larger trade houses generally, yes. Because an agent, too, has your best interests at heart. They know who is interested in what subjects, who is doing biography, who has done well with biography in the past. I mean, it's, and I know when I receive something from, Agent Bob Smith, that he knows what I acquire and what I'm interested in reading. So on that level, yes. For your second question, can an unknown write a biography? I think absolutely. I think, with fiction's kind of a different situation because fiction's just in the writing, so they're totally, absolutely. I buy debut novels quite frequently. I just acquired one last week. But you have to have some connection to the material that seems legitimate. And again, it comes back to that question where I was saying our shorthand for it is he the guy? Is she the woman? And it comes back to, is your connection personal? Is your connection because you grew up in this place and you have a personal obsession? Maybe you have no academic credentials, but there's something about your proposal where it really stands out to me that you are the person who knows more about this subject and can also write about it better than anyone else. Sometimes then those credentials are academic. They have studied this subject or in this field for years and have their doctorate in it, and it's evident based on that. But books wouldn't get published if we didn't take chances on new authors. I think it's a resounding yes. It has to make sense in some way.
Do you have any war stories about how to find an agent or a quirky way to get an agent or something? I'd like to hear something positive about that whole experience.
Here's a question. This is a very naive question because I haven't, fortunately I have the agent I had for 30 years and I haven't thought about agents, but there used to be agents who specialized in biography, and I think George Borchardt was one years ago, but are there still agents who specialize in who you sort of think, biography, this is...
I think there are, and I think that's true. I think then occasionally agents take on a one-off project that interests them. I think it's such a hard question, and I really feel for writers who are trying to get an agent because it's just the deluge that everyone faces, whether it's at the editor level or the agent level, means that sometimes I think our replies are perhaps less than friendly, and I do apologize. Not unfriendly, but it can be very perfunctory. But I do think one of the best ways to get an agent is who is acknowledged in the back of the book of the last 5 biographies you love, that you read, that you think were really published well, and look up that writer or that agent and see who they are and see if they're taking on new clients and write to them. I mean, and write to them very personally. I think some of the, I'm not even an agent, but I was saying I still get emails from writers, and it's so clear that my name was pasted into this long email, and they really have no idea. It'll be a science fiction book or something that's just utterly, I've never done anything like it before. I think if you write a careful, concise, thoughtful letter about, this is why I'm approaching you, I really liked these books, this is what I'm writing, here's who I am, done. It's not a sure bet, but I think if you do enough of those, and I do firmly believe that good writing rises to the top, and for as much as the general world likes to criticize publishers for being elitist and agents for being, I think, kind of elitist, and perhaps that there's some snobbery involved, all we want is to publish a good book. Believe me, all I am waiting for is for a proposal to hit my desk and wow me. And when it does, I'm going to pursue it. And the same can be said for, I would say, most agents whose lists aren't already full. So, yeah.
I think looking at acknowledgements and seeing the ones where of books that you admire, seeing where the authors are genuinely enthusiastic about their agent. That's because there's a lot of chopping and changing and switching. Well-known authors, well-known biographers changing agents, jumping from one well-known agent to another well-known agent. And the other thing, you can go on the web and look at the agents' sites and see whom they represent. And if you feel a kinship with those sorts of authors.
I actually became a acknowledgments junkie to do this, and spent probably 3 months studying and labeling which agent went with which project that I thought was relevant. Wrote all these personal letters and still didn't get answers. But I was also thinking about the fact that we have to get fortunate enough to hit that agent at the right time.
It's a lot about
because the
timing.
agent has 10 top clients and maybe they don't want an 11th. Even if it is a match, they're not going to answer you because they've already maxed out on who they want. So it's also I realized it is a timing thing, that it has to be the right time for that agent to want to acquire another author.
Yes.
I also recommend getting a membership to publishersmarketplace.com, which I think is like $20 a month. And it'll give you a list of most of the major deals that are taking place in publishing. And so you can look up any agent you're interested in. Not all, but most report there. You'll see all the projects they sold over the last 3 years. You'll see what editors are buying what. You can search by biography and see what biographies have sold. It might be a great way if you're thinking about, I'm interested in this subject and I don't want to be the 4th book on Cleopatra. You can look there and see what are the, and have other books sold on this subject already. Again, it's not a 100% sure thing, but it's a way of covering your bases a little bit.
But if you don't want to spend $20 a month, you can go to your public library and look at Publishers Weekly every week, and they have a deals column, and that won't cost you a dime.
It's not as comprehensive, though, I have to say.
Yes.
They're
Well,
very,
maybe your
they're very
public library
selective.
subscribes to
Maybe-
this also.
Maybe.
Hear it for the libraries.
This just to state the obvious, but obviously conferences like this are a great place to meet other biographers who have agents already, and you can find out about agents that way. And obviously, I think that can work really well if there's a good match between the book you want to do and that agent.
And Helen, I wanted to ask you, in your position, do you have a particular anecdote about either something you really regretted not taking or a surprise? Either one.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint you. I can't. Within biography,
Or even memoir, something that didn't do what you thought it would do, or the reverse.
well, I feel like I've already told this story. It was at the first panel, but we published, but it was a memoir, which I feel like we're all down on memoirs right now. But we published a little memoir called Mennonite in a Little Black Dress, and it was acquired at a very modest level and is now #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And it's just such a story of a little book that could. And I offer that just in terms of hope. Because this is a writer who she's wonderful, and she's a gem, and she wasn't connected to anybody, and she found her agent kind of through total happenstance, and he found Holt, but this book just has gotten so much attention and love. I think people really fell for it, that it's really working right now. But I think too, prizes are wonderful too, and I'll tell this story. It's not biography related either, but Holt has been publishing a writer named Hilary Mantel, who is one of the most brilliant writers, I think. I'm just so in love with her work. We've been her publisher for 10 or 15 years, and she's British, and all of her novels have sold very modestly, always tremendously well reviewed. She would never publish a book and not get a great review in the New York Review of Books, or even like the little capsule review in the New Yorker, plus the New York Times Book Review, and regionals across the country. And yet, for some reason, her books did not stick. They didn't take off. But we stuck with her. And I think this does still happen in publishing. And then she wrote a little book called Wolf Hall that won the Booker. And, we've sold hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of copies of this lovely $27 fat, expensive book, right? which is great. And it's long.
Yes.
Also, here's a story, very long. And that book, she's writing, I hate to use the word sequel because I don't know what she would call it, but she's essentially, she had to divide the book in half because it was too long. It's already it's a doorstopper of a novel. And her career has completely, in the U.S. at least, been utterly changed for the good. And I think you never know when that moment might happen. You never know. And it's so fun when it does.
That's good to hear a success story. Anyway, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to
say that there was a big book of agents. And I think it's written by Jeff Herman, who may be in Boston. I've not used it, but I've looked at it, and I think that many agents publish their interests, their specialties, and has many agents within an agency talking. So one's library would probably have one.
And publish and the literary marketplace, which libraries also have list agents.
I'd like to ask a question about reviewers. Let's say I get lucky enough to find the agent and get the publisher, and now the book's coming out. Is it my responsibility in any way to find the reviewers, or is it?
No,
Stay away.
No. I hate it when authors send me things directly.
All right.
It can feel very invasive. What I would say is, and this came up in the previous session, I work very closely with my writers, and I think different editors work differently on this level, but to really get as many really solid blurbs as you can at an early stage, either with bound manuscripts or then later with the galleys. And it may be people, it's all about you and me and your agent emailing, and who do we all know and who do we not know, but we know that they would be interested in your book because of X, Y, or Z, and really targeting them with these manuscripts with the hopes of getting a few blurbs from solid writers whose endorsements may prompt a reviewer to take a second look at something that they might not have otherwise, especially if you're a first-time writer. And that's something I work very closely with. But reviewers are so inundated again, and it's almost like an agent-editor relationship. They have a relationship with the publicists that is very particular, and the publicists know what they're interested in, what they want to read, and the publicists can really tell them, no, you really need to look at this book, whereas they'll just feel overwhelmed and kind of creeped out, I think, if they get
so that's one less thing the author has to do.
It's one less thing.
I'm a book review editor for a newspaper, and I'm getting calls from authors saying, my publicist, my publisher just isn't publicizing the book because of the cutbacks in the publishing industry. So you find more authors are setting up their own tours, and they're getting in contact with the newspapers, and I mean it's a kind of it's a somewhat unhealthy kind of thing. You don't want to have the author talk to you and say, will you please review my book? You kind of want that intermediary between the author and the reviewer. But I don't think publicists, if there are, and there seem to be dozens of publicists, I don't think they're working as hard as they used to.
Oh, I disagree so strongly. The publicists at my company, they have so much more to do. They're overwhelmed.
There are far more books being published.
The publicists in my office are in the office 70 hours a week, and I'm not kidding you, working their butts off for our books.
But is it per book that the amount is
No, and I would say yes, there are certain books that are weighed differently in the house, and that's something that you will sense as an author. I think you will get a sense as you approach, get about 3 to 2 months before pub, if they're taking, I can't really answer that question because books are treated differently. One thing you could do as a writer is invest some of your own money in an independent publicist to help make that. But I mean, I feel like the authors who are speaking to you are lucky in that you're picking up the phone because I think most people
I still answer the phone.
I also feel like a lot of authors can feel neglected when they haven't been neglected, but perhaps their book wasn't the one to break out, and that's kind of from an objective standpoint, but I've seen writers feel upset where I kind of knew in my gut maybe it wasn't the best book on the subject. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's a tricky situation. That said, their publishers are overworked, as are publicists, and
I'll just quickly say that I don't think they're working as hard for the print media as they used to.
They're putting it into electronic.
You mentioned hiring an independent publicist, and that was brought up in the prior session.
Yeah.
How do publishers look on that? Do they go, oh, great, we've got more people on the team, or do they feel like they're being...
It depends on the book. I have to be really honest. Publishers, if they feel like they are investing a huge amount of their own resources into a certain book, and then it's like you get kind of an interluder in who's going to try and take over, it can be very sticky. I would say it's a conversation to have
very carefully with your agent at a certain point. There are other publishers who already know they're not maybe going to do a lot for the book for whatever reason, and they're thrilled that someone else will at your request. It's really a book-by-book situation, and only I really feel like I can't speak on general terms about it. So sometimes what can be very helpful, though, and this also came up in my previous session, is just hiring someone to set up radio or that kind of thing, like a very specific part of the publicity plan, which I, from an editor's perspective, I can find it very helpful for my writers.
I certainly know many writers who are hiring people to do internet
online
for
marketing,
them, very specific, and or radio or certain regions, and I was at a book industry conference that I had to report on last week, and one of the speakers, a publisher, said there are going to be, far fewer individual book ads. There are going to be, whether it's electronic or print, more joint ads, more, a number of books. Mm-hmm. So if you want more individual attention, then you might want to invest in the right kind of outside publicity or marketing help for your book. Mm-hmm. Because there are lots of people out there who'd be happy to take your money. Mm-hmm. But they might not be, and even if they're good for many books, they may not be good for your kind of book.
How do you find those?
You interview them. You are giving them your money. You interview them.
Find out what they know. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel.